The Portent Research podcast is about interviewing researchers and providing an insight into their field and how they think of their field overall. It is specific in exploring and documenting some of their current or past research, from the preconception of their hypothesis right through to the communication of their findings, delving into their decision-making process along the way. And the discussion is generalized in hearing their thoughts on key themes within research and what their line of work takes and requires of them. The aim of Portent Tide is to put the science researchers undertake into a format that is more engaging, with the capacity to reach further out to larger audiences, with a determination to maintain quality and trust with researchers by publishing the discussion in full only upon the approval of the researcher. This podcast is a conversation with Dr. Gloriana Chaverri. Dr. Chaverri is a behavioral ecologist with interest in social behavior and sensory ecology, with a primary focus on a variety of bat species in southwestern Costa Rica, adjacent to a region known as the Osa Peninsula and the Golfito. Gloriana and I have never met in person. This was our first time speaking face to face, so I start by explaining the intentions and process of the podcast. We discuss how she developed her interest with sensory information and bats, and I'll fess up and say that I asked some questions that could have been stated clearer. But this breaks into briefly touching on some areas of research relating to bats that have not been extensively explored. This leads into the focus of the podcast, into research exploring the Spix's disc-winged bat, and how they communicate in relation to locating their roosting structure, a newly formed horn-shaped leaf that amplifies incoming and outgoing communication between group members. We also discuss how Gloriana thinks about some core themes that relate to research and how to navigate the challenges these pose. It was a pleasure speaking with Gloriana. Her work in this field is extensive, and despite covering many topics in this podcast, I can't help but feel we barely scratched the surface in exploring her work. That said, thank you for listening and enjoy the podcast.
Hold on this computer. There we go. So you have until 3, you said?
Yep.
No, okay, cool. So just to briefly fill you in where I'm at with what I'm doing,
Yes.
more or less, I studied environmental science, did a Bachelor of Environmental Science, and then I kind of transitioned to wanting to sort of bridge film with research. And my feeling in doing my own research was that within communication, there was a general lack of context, broadly speaking. And so a few things I wanted to address was research hasn't taken advantage of the internet really, especially in an audio-visual format. And as well as that, well, I needed like a format to do these interviews with. And so within saying there's a lack of context, one, there's a lack of, well, you get cherry-picked data, and you also have only a focus on results. So you don't, in my experience, people don't actually have a genuine understanding of what researchers actually do. And I'm talking from pre-hypothesis creation all the way through to science communication and all the decisions along that way. But I had a difficulty in that obviously research is complex, and how do you bring people along for the story? So the structure I follow is contingent with the scientific method. So that way, regardless of the topic, whether it's related to bats, fungi, neuroscience, engineering, there's that structure. And then I added this sort of decision-making area and the decision-making psychology, sort of general heuristic, sort of as a sense of relatability, I suppose. That, you know, anyone, even if you have no idea what the scientific method is, anyone can just sort of associate with the idea of creating complex decisions. So generally what I found in that was that the overall heuristic that we all use is that we all have a bunch of alternatives. We narrow that down using markers of progress or like our own goals. And within that, there is a cost to acquiring information. So that's in time and energy, In different research, say, especially in the environmental fields, it could be seasonality. It could be that you have a deadline. It could be financial. But I have found in the interviews so far, when people say financial, they're really talking about time and energy. And they're also talking about dividing their time as a scientist and their own personal life. And I'll just say so far, because I was just at Las Cruces, it was really touching to hear that people wanted to talk about life as a scientist and how it can be more human than it's currently portrayed. So if you want to talk about that stuff when I ask these questions, go right ahead. So I'll try to break these up into 20-minute blocks. Just first of all, please introduce yourself and your background, professional background.
Okay. Dr. Gloriana Chaverri. I'm a professor at the University of Costa Rica at a small campus in Golfito. It's called Sede del Sur. And I work with bats primarily as my study organism, but my research focus is primarily on the ecology and behavior. It could be of several animals, but my experience is mostly with bats.
Sure.
So I studied at the University of Boston in the US, and I've been living in Golfito, well, since 1997, but then I came back after my PhD in 2006. So, yeah.
What was it? Two things. What drew you to the US and what drew you back down to Golfito?
Well, Golfito drew me many years ago. So when I finished my bachelor's degree in Heredia, Universidad Nacional, I found a job here in Golfito, and I wanted to get out of the city and also, try to work near marvelous places like Corcovado and other protected areas in the area. So I started working here in Golfito, and then I found an opportunity to do a PhD. Especially, I was particularly drawn to do my PhD in Boston because there was a really good professor there, Dr. Tom Kunz. He was famous for his work with bats. So I decided to work alongside him.
Okay. What drew you to bats, of all things?
Well, so my love with bats started when I was doing my bachelor's degree. We were taking a mammalogy course, and the professor asked us to work on a group of mammals, an order of mammals that we wanted to, and everyone was choosing primates and cetaceans and felines and all those, charismatic mammals. And then at the end, we hadn't decided. A friend of mine and I were going to work together with this for this project, and we selected at the end, and the only group that was left were bats. So we decided to do the project with bats, and we started learning about them, and we fell in love with them. We knew very little about them, like most people, I think, but yeah.
I'm interested sure. Whenever people start learning, I'm always interested whether, especially in the biological fields, whether they start with the small details or the larger details. In other words, do you start with anatomy or do you start with landscape level behavior? Where did you start?
No. Well,
there's different strategies to both, right? Like some people, their learning strategy would be beneficial to start that larger information, but for some people, they just want to get into cell structure, and they want to get into neuroscience of, say, bats, which I really want to get into as well. But yeah, there are different strategies, so that's why I'm so curious about that.
I don't think I had a strategy really defined. I think for me it was mostly when I was choosing my topic for my PhD. Before I even got accepted into the university, I started reading a lot of books about bats just to familiarize myself with the most recent research that was being done. And there was one really, really good book from John Altrigan, and that was The Biology of Bats. And I started reading it, and I read a topic that was really interesting, and it was about how little we knew of mating systems in bats.
Okay.
So I thought, oh, this is a topic that would be interesting. So I just dove into the topic when I started my PhD. And from there, what happened is that some ideas continue to be strong and to be fascinating to you, but then there are other things you start learning that you didn't know about. So it's difficult to pinpoint a strategy that you use for your research from the start. Maybe now I'm using different strategies to select the type of studies that I do, but at the beginning it was like very random, I think.
I understand. So in my preparation for this interview, I sort of separated it into anatomy and behavior, and and when I think about this kind of stuff, as I thought about with that audiovisual topic, you realize once you get into it, there isn't really a separation. Like they behave based on, their behavior is directed from the direction of their senses. So it's difficult to pinpoint the best areas because it's such a fascinating order. But I suppose you just talked about mating. So how, given the senses that bats have, maybe we can elaborate a bit more on what they have. Given those senses, why go for a tournament strategy, or why go for a pair bonding strategy within bats versus more polyamorous? Yeah, or more tournament species. Do you know what I'm saying?
No.
Okay, I'm thinking. So what is their mating strategy? Is it that are they pair bonding, like one male and female bond for life, or is it more, say a male mates with multiple different females? And I guess I'm wondering this because it's such a vastly different species, and how they find each other is so much different compared to other species that I just wondered, well, they have to locate each other somehow. Is it just easier to just be pair bonding for life if it's difficult to locate each other? That might be a silly question, but it's something that ran through my head.
So you're talking about bats in general, or?
Yeah, bats in general or specific species. I know it's a silly question, but it was something that popped into my head. I'm like, if it's difficult to find each other, why wouldn't they just stay with each other for life?
So there's such a huge variation in mating systems for bats that there's no one size fits all strategy. So there's always this idea that mating may be random and you select whomever you find along the way, but it's not. I mean, it really isn't like that. There's always a process of selection. And that selection can be something that's basically ephemeral. So you go to a site where you know that the males hang around, for example, and then there you select your partner, your mating partner. Or you can select a roost or place where the bats will be sleeping during the day, and that roost is very permanent, like a cave, and then within your cave you can find your mating partner, for example. So sure. It's like it all depends on, for example, the type of roost the bats are using. And so we have from species like the one that I study, the Spix is this winged bat, that they change roosts every day, and then you have the ones inside caves that they stay there for many years and generations even. So within these more ephemeral roost sites, you can find species for like the one that I'm studying. Again, we really don't know who they're mating with, but we know it's not within their roost, for example. They're not forming pair bonds or these long-term mating
Okay.
associations with the ones that they're sleeping with during the day. But in other cases, we find that the males that the females are sleeping with during the day, those are the ones that are siring a large part of the pups that they have. So it's so variable. There's really no.
Okay. No, that's a good bit of information to start with. Okay, I can kind of go two directions there. I'm interested in so the offspring. I'm curious how bats as juveniles start to learn about their environment and how they might play with each other in order to learn.
Yeah, I don't know. I've never read any papers or have an idea whether pups play with each other. That's actually very interesting because I've never seen that, even though we know that a lot of pups for different mammals that we know that they play with each other, but we don't know anything about that for bats. So
Okay. And is there any idea of involvement of males, parental involvement?
Well, basically very little. So what we know about males getting involved, the majority of species that we know of, males really don't get involved. There is a species, I forgot the name, that supposedly the males produce a little milk and they can nurse the pups apparently, but it's something that there's one paper published on that and there's not like continuous information about that. We really don't know what's going on. But in terms of how the males are involved, I would say very, very little. Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right, interesting. I'm just conscious of time, so I want to address once the bats have perceived their environment, or once that they've sensed their environment rather, and that information has come into their brain and body, what does their perception look like in that combination of visual and echolocation? What are they visually, it's hard to say visually seeing, but what does the image look like within their mind? Is there any sense of what's happening there?
No.
That's right. Because I think I started to look at a study, I think by Nachum Blanovsky, and he was talking about the hippocampus and learning and memory. And so it just made me very curious about what these things, you have to wonder what other thing, how animals really see the world and how they take that information in and how that's stored. And I think of any species that within mammals that is so sensory, so different in the senses. I imagine whatever that image looks like must be vastly different.
Yeah, most likely, because even like bats are guiding themselves primarily with sound, and so how do we even start to understand how sound looks like in our, how it's interpreted in our brain or in the bat's brain? Ooh, that's so difficult to know. But then also color perception varies so much. Like every group of mammals, even within bats, some may be able to perceive a certain range of colors, others are not so discriminatory in the way they perceive colors. So it's so difficult. It varies so much between species. So
okay. I'm asking some difficult questions, clearly. That's okay. What do I want to get to? Can we, before we get into the study, can we just describe the types of the anatomy of the disc wingbat?
Yep. So it's a fairly small species. So around an average of 4 grams, more or less, which for bats it's small. And then it has the the dorsal fur is brownish and the ventral is whitish, more or less. But then, of course, the most interesting thing about this species is that they have the disc or adhesive pads near their hands and their feet. So those structures are quite important for the kind of roosting lifestyle that they have. So they're extremely useful and very, very vital for being able to cling to the smooth surfaces of the tubular leaves that they use for roosting.
Okay, great. What is their eyesight like?
And what?
Their eyesight, what's that? What's the quality of their vision?
I don't think it's really known for these species. So okay. Yeah, they have tiny, tiny eyes. Sometimes it's difficult to even see them. But no, I don't think there's any studies, none that I know of this site.
Cool. Well, I guess when I sort of go through the papers, more or less, I think I describe it as basically researcher-led. I'll just ask some questions if I don't understand anything. But also within this, it's fine if I don't understand some words. Please use the terminology. It's fine. And my approach to this is that we can take the difficult thing of understanding that and break it down in time.
Okay.
Also, you did this with another author. It was Erin H. Gillam. Maybe we could say a little bit about her as well, and your involvement and how you met her to do this work.
Well, I met Erin several years ago, I think around 2008 or 9. So I was doing a postdoc at the moment with a colleague, Martin Bonhoff, and he knew Erin Gillam from working with her before and meeting her in symposiums and all that stuff that we scientists do. And so I started to become interested in this aspect of communication in this disc-winged bats, because I started noticing that the bats were, hanging out together, and it seemed like they were using acoustic communication to find each other. And so I was talking to Martin about this idea, and he suggested that I meet with Erin, and that Erin would come to Golfito and we can start a collaboration. So Erin came, and the first paper that I published on communication with Thyroptera was with Erin Gillam. And after that, the topic went, like, it was so famous, and everyone was hearing about this study that they were using communication to find the roost and each other. And so we continued doing some studies, and I think one of the last ones was the one on how they're using or could be using the roosts as a mean to amplify their social goals. And Erin, she's a dear friend of mine, and she works at North Dakota State University in the US.
Okay, fantastic. So in that early process of learning, where did you begin to see the gap of information to say, like that's where we want to build our hypothesis around? And I suppose within describing, sometimes I think of this as a puzzle, and whether I'm wondering, is there a lot of puzzle pieces already placed, or is it looking pretty empty? If that makes sense.
Yeah. So let's see. So the first part is, I forgot the first part already.
Sorry. Do you want me to say it again?
Yeah, you did. I remember the second.
So, and in terms of the puzzle, is it looking complete, or is it looking sort of empty, I suppose?
No, but I remember the first time now, the first part. Okay, so when we started doing this work on whether the bats were communicating to find the roost or to find each other, I started looking at papers on bats and how they were, and whether they were using some sort of communication to find each other. And so, of course, we realized there was very, very little done on the topic, and there were basically no experiments like the ones we were doing. So people were suspecting that the bats were using sound to locate each other when they were locating or finding roosts during the day, but no experiments were done, and that were so straightforward at demonstrating that they're actually calling to each other, like in this Marco Polo sort of communication fashion. So the thing is that there's so little done on that issue in bats that it was like a white canvas, right? There was nothing on the topic, and so we started to develop all these ideas, but primarily based on a lot of information that's been done on other animals, right? So, and what we've been doing is, I think of research like this tree, right? So there's maybe this initial branch that you have this idea and you develop it, but then after this, you get all these new questions. And so you start picking, okay, so this new branch is taking me to these other questions. I never see science as a product or an answer to a question. I see like the continuous and continuous and continuous branches that correspond to new questions, new areas, and lead to new discoveries. So
sure.
That's
okay. Well, let's sort of state the hypothesis, and then I suppose decide, explain your decision in each component of the method.
Say that again.
So let's state the hypothesis.
Which hypothesis?
The hypothesis to this paper.
Okay. So the one on how the leaves amplify the calls?
Yes. Sorry, I wasn't clear about that. Yes, that one. Yeah.
Okay. So in that case, our hypothesis was that but it has two possibilities, because the way we started is that we were thinking that the leaves were acting as a distorter of the calls that the bats were producing. So I have to take you back to a previous experiment we did before, because we did an experiment where we were placing the bats inside the leaf, and we were reproducing calls, the calls that they emit from outside. And the bats inside the roost did not seem to recognize their group members.
Right.
So we started to think, and our initial hypothesis was that the leaves are creating a sound distortion for the incoming calls, right? So within this hypothesis, that this is the way we started the rest of the study. But actually, and you could see it in another way, it's also that the way I think we try to focus the study, and this is something interesting in the process of doing research, that sometimes your initial hypothesis is not as sexy, or it could not be as attractive. So we ended up focusing this study mostly on the sexy topic, which was how the leaves are amplifying the social calls of the bats. So our hypothesis in that case would be that the leaves are acting as acoustic horns or amplifiers, sound amplifiers, and that this would create this increase the amplitude of the calls that the bats are perceiving. So
okay, so clearly the challenge there was to think, okay, how do we replicate this? So please, yeah. So explain how you decided on what you did. Yeah.
It was actually, the process of thinking about how to do it was really not that complicated. And then the way we actually did it, the experiment, was so easy. It took us, I think, literally like 3 days to collect the whole data. So I think this has been the easiest study in terms of how we plan the methods and then also collecting the data. This is very strange because normally, like in a lot of my research, I've spent several years collecting data, but in this case, it was very straightforward. So the process of deciding the experiment was fairly easy. So no, we wanted to do an experiment to see how the leaf was affecting sound perception, or yeah, the amplitude of the sound. So we just did an experiment where we had a microphone inside a leaf that they would normally use for roosting, and a microphone without the leaf. And so we just reproduced calls, and we wanted to see those differences with and without the leaf. So it was a fairly straightforward experiment.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're describing, because I do have a question later on that's normally about adaptability in research. And people often describe, well, so far they've often described me like, yeah, like adaptability is completely key. But it sounds like in that situation, it was just fortunate to be able to just think, oh, it was exactly what we thought it would be. Is that fair? Okay.
Yes.
Awesome. Awesome. So it was interesting because you described that horns can be either outgoing or incoming in the paper.
Huh? Yep.
Maybe do you want to speak to that? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So the interesting thing about this species that hasn't been found yet in other bats is that they have what is called like a call and response communication system. So what happens is that when you flush bats from a roost, or they get scared, or the leaf opens up and they have to find a new roost during the day, so they all fly away at the same time. So the entire group, let's say 5 or 6 individuals, and they start flying very, very cohesively. And so what they're doing is trying to find as quickly as possible a leaf that they go into for roosting. So in this process, when they're flying around, they're producing this type of calls that we named inquiry calls. So they're like vocalizing constantly in addition to echolocation calls. So once one of the group members finds a leaf, so this individual hears the inquiry calls, then this individual will start producing a separate type of call, which is called a response call. So they will start responding to the ones that are flying. And so once the individual starts producing these response calls, then the rest of the group will go into the leaf very quickly. It's a very, very fast system of communication. So when we did this experiment for this paper, the outgoing calls were the response calls. So what happens, for example, if a bat is in a structure that's not tubular, like their typical roosts, will the sound be produced with the same intensity and the same fidelity, not distorted? Or the other way around is the incoming call. So the incoming call would be the inquiry call that's produced by the flying individuals and would be received by the bat inside the roost. So that's the process, basically.
That makes sense. And I think at the beginning of the paper, you discussed the idea of attenuation. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, so attenuation is the loss of strength or volume for a given call. So basically what we're looking at is the opposite of the attenuation, whether the calls are increased in volume by the aid of the tubular structures. But attenuation is certainly an incredibly important aspect of the process of communication, because there's 2 ways to recognize the sound. So when you're communicating with sound, you first have to hear the sound, and then you have to recognize the information provided in the call. But if you cannot hear the call, there's no way you can do the second process. So attenuation is really, really critical for acoustic communication.
So I have 2 questions there. Do the bats always leave the same whenever they do anything, whether it's looking for like foraging or flying, finding a new leaf to roost in? Are they always doing this together, are they always with each other, or is it, do they sometimes they go out solo, sort of pioneering?
We really don't know what happens at night. That's one of the big questions that we have, not only for this species, but many other bat species, because it's almost impossible to follow them. And there's some new technologies that are being used that you can track bats during their movement, but the every single one of these apparatus or these devices that might be used for that, they're too big for a lot of the species, including the disc-wing bats. Mm-hmm. So we know that during the day, they're really doing basically everything together. They're roosting together, and if they get scared from the roost, they go find one together. We know that maybe for a part of the night, they may be doing activities together, but we really don't know if they're foraging together or doing other stuff as a group also.
Okay, I understand. Let's get into results. And within the results, I have the question around depiction of figures and tables. I think the reason I had this question is when I studied, I had a teacher say that you should be able to get rid of all writing and just rely on those, and someone who's never done this should be able to reproduce whatever you've done, provided they have the background. So I'm interested in maybe you can say the results first and then describe why you decided to depict them the way you have.
So, okay, so there's two main results, right? So one is how the sound and whether the sound gets distorted and if the sound gets amplified or not. So the idea of sound getting distorted is really complicated because it depends on the frequency of the sound. So the way you have to present that is to show a graph where you can really see how the real frequency is different from the perceived frequency, the one we actually recorded. So in that sense, for example, it would have been not very nice to have a table showing that. So a graph where you can have this relationship between frequency, between the original call frequency and how the perceived frequency varies. It's I think it was the only way to really get into the answer of what was going on. And then the other idea of how, and we did this for both type of calls, right? For the response and the inquiry calls, and then whether the volume of the call was changing. I think for me it was the most exciting finding, because even for the inquiry calls, the incoming calls, it was very fascinating to see how the volume was changing or the perceived sound was changing depending on how deep we place the microphone. So the deeper the bat goes into the leaf basically means the louder the sound will be perceived. So for me it was very striking and very easy to show that in a very simple graph. So.
And I guess that begs the question: do they know that the bats? Are you more likely to find them at the bottom of the leaf?
Well, I mean, we always know that when the bat goes into the leaf, they immediately go to the bottom as deep as they can. But it could be two things: that they can hear their group members better if they're flying around, or the other, that they can hide better from predators, because if they go deep into the leaf, then the shade may be able to hide them a bit better. So okay. Yeah, awesome. We don't know.
Yeah, cool. And I think you let me, sorry, I have this in front of me, and you sort of had like a heat map. And for me, that kind of helped me understand actually a little bit better as well. So it seems as though it was a way to pinpoint like that attenuation is like the sound is less of a what am I trying to say? Like a more narrow angle as opposed, right? Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah,
So,
yeah. It was really difficult to try to picture how we wanted to show that difference, especially because we couldn't present like an average heat map, right? It was, or at least we didn't find a way to do that. So what we wanted to, at the end, what we decided is to present the least and the most striking differences, right, between having or not having a leaf to focus that sound. So I think the heat map ended up being, yeah, also it helps me a lot also to understand what's going on.
Yeah, yeah, no, it certainly does with me. I'm terrible mathematically, so like whenever I see something visual, I'm like, okay, now I finally got it. So yeah, let's. How did you reflect on how did you reflect in the discussion when you were writing it? How did you reflect on the hypothesis, but also how did you reflect on that blank canvas as well that we discussed earlier?
Yeah, this paper ended up being really difficult, and the discussion was, and trying to, for me myself, trying to understand what was going on was very difficult. I actually contacted several people that had more experience with acoustics, and especially people that were a bit more familiarized with horn acoustics. And I tried to write, and I wrote to several people, and they never responded. That was very sad. But trying to understand what was going on and to interpret that and put that into the discussion was for me the biggest challenge. So I started reading up about several acoustical mechanics, like for example, one that's called the waveguide that I didn't know of. And I started to understand that waveguides or structures that may be limiting and maybe creating reflections, and those reflections start to create this chaotic acoustic scene. Just trying to understand that was really, really challenging. But then when I did understand that, it all made sense why we were finding, for example, this huge sound distortion, especially for the incoming calls. But then it was also fascinating because with the results that we got, we could start to explain some of our previous findings, right? That the bats inside the leaf seemed to not be able to recognize the calls from their group members when they were coming into the leaf. So we were starting to put together a lot of this, or a small part of this story that's the communication in this species that's so unique.
Now I wonder, so this was done in, I think it was done in 2013, is that correct?
Yeah.
Roughly about the time. So it's what, 8 years later, where has that story sort of evolved? And then we can, after that, we'll move on to some different questions.
So what I always wanted to do is to see whether, because one of the criticisms of the paper was that this is all theoretical, right? We don't know what the bats were doing. It was all, actually, we didn't handle any bats for this study, right? So what people were criticizing is we don't know what the bats are doing. We don't know if the bats are selecting leaves that are better for amplifying the calls, for example. And or also perhaps if the bats are modifying their calls in a way, for example, the bats inside the roost, are they changing their calls so that they fit quite nicely with the shape of the leaf and they can amplify or, you know, keep at least the fidelity of the sound. So we're going to start this project next year. So we're going to start looking at the shapes of the leaves, how the leaves may change how the incoming and the outgoing calls are perceived, and from there also determine if the bats are also changing their calls to fit the leaves better. So this is like a 3 or 4 year project. So.
Awesome. That actually sounds really cool. I'm looking forward to hearing more about it. So I think these questions are sort of they're sort of, I kind of think of them better as themes, and they're kind of common themes that might follow the scientific method. But I've found that as I've asked them to more people, they're really, for example, there's a question of motivation and drive, and that exists at every stage. But yeah, I'm interested in, again, just as a scientist and as a person outside of scientists, how more like, you know, someone who thinks, oh, I have to manage my time to be a balanced person, for example. So it's okay if that's the answer as well. So the first question is, what is the driving force? Is your driving force? Is it curiosity, for example? Is it in complexity? Is it motivated by competition, or something else maybe?
That's always a good question, because I guess this is as diverse as we are as humans. But for me, it always started with curiosity. So when I start thinking about, I have this question, I have to answer this question. I get so anxious about having this question and trying to wonder, what would happen? What would the bats do? Or what would even the people? I start thinking about the behavior of people, and I have this, burning, curiosity about what happens. What's the question? But I think also a big part of the research is also like, how do I create a good image of myself? Because even though the first one is to curiosity, there's also a huge drive for us to do better, to be recognized as scientists. And I mean, also like being seen or being respected as a scientist is also important. So I think in answering these questions, you also have this bonus, which is that people start respecting you and start respecting your ideas and you as a scientist a lot more. So I think it's also part of egocentric or something, a perspective about how to create a better picture of yourself. I don't know.
I understand. So I kind of consider that to be sort of the initial point of that search, the initial search. But then the point that immediately follows that is, how do you know you have enough information before you decide on that hypothesis? Or in other words, you only have so much time to gather information, and especially for complex fields, you're never going to read everything. It might be more fortunate to be in a field that there's less information, for example. But yeah, when do you know that you have the right information, or what's the thought process? Then I can act on this information now, and let's begin.
I don't know if there's actually like a set formula or an amount of information that you can say really makes sense. I think when you have more information, it's sometimes even better, because you can go into a topic more in depth. When you have very little information, you can stay on the surface a little bit, but never dive into your topic that much. So one thing is having enough information to start your project, right? So enough that you have developed your hypothesis and you want to dive into your project. I'd say, I don't know, I think at least if you have a clear picture, you have your model system, you understand it well, and you have this question that maybe has been responded or not in other organisms, and then you say, I think my study organism would fit well enough and would be useful for answering this question that maybe no one has answered, or other people have answered, but maybe my study system is different. Okay.
Yeah.
But then is the process of deciding when you have enough information from your own data collection to say, okay, I have enough support for my results, and this is good enough. Sure. So I think those are different.
And it seems to me that the question, I mean, the concept of risk is all throughout the research again. But I'm interested how you conceptualize risk in research, or whether or not you even place it in a matrix, or that might sound boring to some people, but to me, it's about how you mitigate that within this whole process. And maybe if, for example, if you're going to challenge past research, especially if it's a well-established theory or a really well-backed hypothesis, what's the thought process in thinking, well, as you said already, you're thinking about how scientists will perceive you. But then again, if you find that your data challenges their research, that it seems like that's the direction you have to take. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, in terms of challenging known theories and all that stuff, I think it is important, but you have to be respectful also. So if you're going to challenge a huge idea, you have to have huge data, huge results. I mean, it has to be well supported. So this is the first thing you have to do. And for me, if you're also going to challenge known or established ideas, you also have to be respectful about how those ideas first came to be. So I've seen people just bluntly say, no, the work by this and these people is worthless, or it's not good quality or whatever. But I mean, there was a process for those people as well. So you have to be very respectful about that. So I don't see that necessarily as a risk. I mean, I think this is something interesting, but you have to be very respectful during this process. And then the process of doing research in general always involves a lot of risk. But the strategy that I use is that I try to incorporate the majority of my research ideas to be fairly easy or safe, more or less. But then you can have certain ideas that are a bit more risky. The thing is, you have to counterbalance. So you want to be you want to create novel results and novel studies, novel technologies or methodologies, but you need to collect the data as well. So you have to try to balance these two in a way that you can still produce the science, but still be able to take some of those risks. And the final risk that I wanted to talk about is the risk to the animals. So your study animals, like we work with animals, and we need the same individuals to be alive year after year. So if I have to do a study that involves a lot of risk to the animals, I do not do it. So this is my first priority, is always to make sure that the animals are happy, are alive, are healthy. And so this risk I never take.
Okay, no, cool. That's the first time I've got that answer so far, so it's good to hear. Okay, so expectations in research. When is it good? Is it safe to carry forward expectations, especially after you've got your set hypothesis and methods, or does there need to be a trust in process that you've made?
For me, it's you have to trust the process. If I have expectations about, I mean, I have the question and I want to answer the question. But if I start to think about, this is what I expect this to be, or expect this to publish in this journal or whatever, I think you get disappointed very, very quickly. So for me, it's always the major thing. I want to answer the question. And if it leads me to where I planned, great. But if not, that's also great as well.
Okay, yeah, because that next question was about adaptability. So you've already given me that. Okay, satisfaction and dissatisfaction in research. And I tie this to the idea of the concept of failure. But so far I've gotten the answer out of different people. Some people see that failure is in research. Some people think, well, if I get a different result, that's insightful as well. So I wonder if your ideas match up with that or different again.
I think actually, for me, the most fascinating answers to my questions when they were not expected, when they were different that when I originally originally expected. That's when I go, this is fascinating. What's causing this? For example, when we were doing this experiment to see if the bats inside the roost were recognizing group members from non-group members, we of course expected that they would recognize them. But then when they did not, then this led to this other fascinating research we did. So I think for me, it's typically like that.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Next question is in relation to cooperation, and I've added something else to this, sort of collaboration. I wonder if you see the difference between those two in your mind?
So cooperation is, for me, it's really the act of sharing your knowledge and sharing your time and your resources, which could or could not lead to a collaboration in the sense of producing a paper together, for example. So I think most people, if, I don't know if they interpret this the same way that I do, but I think they see both as leading. Normally a cooperation leads to a collaboration, but I don't think it should always be like that. So.
Sure. And I have a question that just popped into my head then. In your field, what are some different disciplines that you normally might work with? For example, it's very common for biologists to work with geographic information scientists to map their work. Is there stuff like that?
Yeah, actually, one of the projects we were doing includes a geographer also that, she's involved in my research. I've worked with chemists as well. I would have loved to work with, people in the physical acoustics, but those are the people that never answered my emails.
Throwing some shade to them.
Yeah, but no, I think primarily I've worked with biologists mostly. So, yeah.
This is kind of like sort of like the conclusion or sign off of research papers. I wonder if you see a responsibility or not to instruct people on what to do with your work that you've done. Often you see in different research papers, some people do see it as their responsibility, and often you see people write very lofty conclusions, which sort of like as you suggested earlier with in relation to that risk of challenging previous people. It seems to be a similar idea that you shouldn't say stuff that the data doesn't represent. So I'm almost wondering, do you just let the data speak for itself, or should you? Yeah.
I think it depends on the study that you did. So for studies that are really about the just basic data, basic research, I think it's more or less you let the data speak for itself, for themselves or whatever. Yeah. But then for example, we've also worked with or done research on topics that are more conservation oriented. For example, right now I'm working on a paper on how we should consider social animals a special case in their protection or harvesting and all that stuff. So they're social, so we need to be careful about removing some of the group members when we harvest them. So in this case, this sort of paper would involve a big part of trying to communicate to the people what we suggest that should be done. And if we had the time and were as responsible as we should be, we should try to also take this information to policymakers and people in the government that may be able to take some action into improving or taking into account our suggestions. But Yeah, I think it depends on the study that you do.
It's interesting. I wonder, do you ever feel a sense of danger in saying, well, is my research really representative, especially when you're going to that level of government policy, which is clearly can have the capacity to go in either direction?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's the same as, big claims need big data. So if you have a lot of data that really support your claim, and you think this is a major issue that, for example, in our case, we were doing research on cave bats. We want to make sure that those cave bats are protected, and we have enough information that shows that tourism into caves affects bats. So, and there's so much information around the world that we are sure this is something that has to change, incorporated into the policy somehow. So I think it's the same. You need, if you want to change something legally, you have to have good data to support it.
Sure. That kind of leads well into my final question of science communication. And I think it's good to say, like, all these questions I've been asking to myself, like from the start of this interview to now, about what I'm doing. And within science communication, that's clearly kind of where I sit. When I started this out, I feel like I saw a very big risk in challenging what I kind of see as legacy media, it's kind of had that name put more recently, which is newspapers, TV, publishing houses, and radio. And I think, and also social media platforms, which have immense power and generally not used to good means. And then on the other end of that, you've got new forms of long form discussions like this, podcasts that are coming up, and they're also vulnerable to things like, censorship in different forms, a lack of context, and often highly emotive language, which is used to color research. And as a consequence, I kind of see it as the people's typical understanding of research is quite poor, in my assessment. So my assessment is like, well, these are all the options we have in making this choice. And my markers of progress are two things. It's to communicate better with scientists and communicate better with non-scientists. And that needs quality communication and reach. And the quality of communication has to come first, in terms of, well, I'd rather reach one person with the right message than a million people with the wrong message, because that million number of people can do some pretty crazy shit. So if they have the wrong stuff. So I guess with that picture painted, I'm wondering, first of all, do you agree? And as a consequence, how do you make a choice when you have a new research? How do you choose where you want to communicate it?
I completely agree. I think one of the main problems that I've seen, for example, in media in Costa Rica, like this paper that we're discussing, when it came out, it was publicized by several, or one or two newspapers here in the country, and they completely misunderstood the results, and it was very confusing trying to explain this to a lot of people, and then they were not given the right information to the overall public. But then I was also interviewed and asked for information from other sources, and they were so good at interpreting the data that I had. And so I know that their message was the right one. So definitely the quality of the message is way more important than the reach, like you say. And then what I've been trying to do with my results is that if I have a paper that I want to publicize a little bit more, then I try to create the news myself. So for example, we have not an arrangement, but there's some people at the University of Costa Rica, and then we send our news to them. We write it down, we send the photos, and we make sure that when they write the the story. They send it back to us. We make sure that it's correct, and then it gets publicized. So I think inevitably you have to play a big part into creating the story, and then making sure that it reaches the correct audience as well. But
yeah. I should say that's exactly the same as my version of this. It's like once I've got this file, I send it to the researcher and they say I'm happy with or not.
yes.
So I think to finish on, I'd be sort of remiss if I didn't ask this question. There'd be people coming up through this current time right now finding out about information about bats, and it's being diluted through this system that we're just talking about, and like specifically during COVID for obvious reasons, right? They're going to be going into your field probably. What do you think about that? If they're absorbing information through this sort of media system and learning, well, now I want to go into this field. Do you feel like you have a sense of trust in where they'll be starting? Does that make sense?
I have to repeat. I'm not quite sure.
I guess I'm wondering, with a background of COVID information and the information about bats that have come out of China and that's been reported through the media system, that's generally by and large that legacy media. Okay, if people want to come into the area of understanding diseases, they might want to go into the area of understanding bats. And I'm wondering if they're starting with information that is potentially misinformation and they're coming into your field. Well, how do you think about that? You're going to have to be dealing with those people.
It's a very complex topic, because I don't think a lot of it's necessarily misinformation. It's just how it's interpreted. For example, a lot of the virologists know that bats are a repository. No, how do you say that? Oh, I forgot the name. Well, they harbor a lot of these coronaviruses, right?
Yeah.
We know it exists like that, but the thing is, the misinformation is people are thinking that the actual, COVID-19 came directly from bats, from the interaction of humans with bats, and that's where the message gets very confusing. So one thing is for the bats to harbor those viruses, and the other is how the viruses are reaching the people. And so this entire missing middle piece, I think it's very critical, because, okay, you're interested in viruses, you have to study bats. But why are bats special? Are they really special or not? I think they're not, in terms of how many viruses they have necessarily. It's just that they have been severely studied for this topic. And so I think that creates a bias, and people are just saying, yeah, we're going to get into bats because we're interested in viruses. But there's a lot of other animals that haven't been studied as much. So
sure, I understand.
So yeah, that's definitely a very interesting topic.
Yeah, and do you kind of feel as though that idea itself, that the idea that bats aren't as representative of these viruses, has been perpetuated by the media as well?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think it's the scientists are to blame largely as well, because they want to publish their results in a big journal with all these headlines and all that stuff, and I think they're just creating too much noise around the topic that's not that relevant. And bats are not that special in terms of how many viruses they have, but the scientists themselves are creating this image, which is obviously very problematic as well.
Okay, I understand. I think one question to conclude, just a bit of a tangent. Efrain said you were going to be working with your sister on something in relation to fungi on bats.
Yeah,
I think that just really intrigued me after speaking with him, and I guess I want to hear a little bit more about that.
Very quickly, because I have to leave, but
sure. That's fine.
It's such a fascinating study. Yeah, so my sister works with fungi, and she was interested in us doing some collaboration. So she came up with this brilliant idea of whether if the bats are consuming fruits and there's fungi within those fruits, if the bats may be responsible for dispersing some of those fungi within those fruits, and if they're helping certain species of fungi to remain within their feces and then spread those fungi wherever they poop. So the idea is, that's more or less where we're heading. Whether the bats are playing an important role in this interaction with the fruits and the fungi, and if this happens with different species, different fruits, what's the interaction there? That's more or less the study.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, so far it's two fields. Like I honestly didn't know a lot about bats, and I didn't know a lot about fungi. So it's been really exciting to learn this stuff. So I really appreciate it again.
Sure. Yeah, you're welcome.
And I if you want to in the future to have more conversations about this, about whatever future research, I found it really, even though I say Efrain is only sort of halfway through doing his stuff, it's nice kind of having that halfway point, because it's sort of exciting to see, well, what's going to happen now, and it adds that sort of suspense to it. But it's nice.
Okay.
Awesome. All right. Thanks.
Thank you for the conversation. Your questions are like something fresh, because typically some of the questions are always the same. So it's nice to talk about the science and not necessarily just about the bats. So.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sorry for the confusing questions to begin with, but I guess I'm trying to organize my own thoughts around how senses impact behavior. So I'm still figuring it out.
No, you did well.
Thank you. All right, I appreciate it. Enjoy your afternoon, and thank you again.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Portent Tide is independent from the researchers on the podcast. If you wish to support them in any manner, a link is provided from the researcher to allow for this. This can be found on Portent Tide YouTube channel, Instagram, and directly through the Portent Tide website. If you enjoyed the podcast and you wish to support Portent Tide produce more conversations like this that provide an insight into how researchers work, you can do so directly through the links provided on the Portent Tide website or through wherever you found this podcast. Thank you again for listening, and any support and feedback is much appreciated.